Hello and good morning, maybe good afternoon, or wherever it might be in the world that you're listening at this time. But welcome back to the For the Property Investor podcast. Here with, of course, it couldn't be anyone else but Nick Bendel, who brings us the news. Hello, Nick.
Great to be with you, Owen. Normally, I'm dialing in from Sydney, which is cold this time of year, but I'm enjoying a working holiday in Darwin. And as some people might notice, I am wearing shorts and a t-shirt.
Yeah, t-shirt on this podcast at this time of year. It's just like unfathomable of how you could turn up like this, and uh, really tempting us all to go on a winter holiday.
Well, Darwin is beautiful this time of year. The weather is perfect, and it's such a scenic city with a lot of interesting history and culture. So I recommend it to everyone.
Great. I will make it there one day. It's maybe we need to open our property management business in Darwin.
Exactly. Leafield needs to expand to Darwin. You're in every other state and territory, I think, except for Tassie. Is that right?
Tassie and ACT. So
Okay.
yeah, so those three states and territories are the ones that are left. So we'll get
Ah,
there one day.
so which one do you think will be next?
Oh, it's there's a good chance it could be Tassie, but ACT could come in swinging fast and quick. You never know.
Well, ACT does seem like the logical option, given that you're in New South Wales and Victoria. But I have to tell you, I love Tassie, such a beautiful part of Australia. And I've always loved the territory as well. So if you wanted to move into one of those two places first, I would give you my seal of approval.
Is there anywhere you don't love in Australia, Nick?
Well, we are so blessed to live in this country. It's peaceful, it's prosperous, it's safe. There's so much natural beauty. And because it's such a large country and because it's a continent, we have so much diversity of flora and fauna, which is another blessing.
Yes. See, we can be lovers of the natural environment as well as lovers of property investment all at the same time.
Exactly. And another thing I love about living in Australia, or at least living in Sydney, is we get to say bad things about Melbourne.
Well, it's a given, isn't it? Yeah.
It is, but what do people in other countries do? They don't have that pleasure.
Well, I think they have their own rivalries, friendly rivalries. We don't have any, actual hatred for Melbourne. It's just a friendly rivalry.
Indeed, and I'm actually going there for business later this month and in August as well.
Okay, so we will keep it friendly today, just in case someone's listening from there.
Exactly. Got to keep it friendly for at least the next few weeks.
Yes. And have you been getting any work done in the last week since you've been up in Darwin?
I have. I've been enjoying some leisurely breakfasts and lunches and dinners, but I've also been doing some work in between. I'm lucky that I can work from anywhere in the world.
Great. So, so what has been happening this past week?
Well, for those who don't know, I'm the owner of Hunter and Scribe, which is a copywriting agency that writes content for finance and property professionals. And we received a lovely testimonial from the CEO of Avanti Accountants, who's one of our who are one of our longtime clients. And she wrote, "I've been working for a long time with Hunter and Scribe, and I've always been really impressed by their reliability, their professionalism, and the quality of their writing. They're very knowledgeable about accounting and business, and have also taken the time to learn about my niche, which is the NDIS. I'd be very happy to recommend them to other accountants." It really warmed my heart when we got that very nice review over the past week.
Nice. It always is nice when you get a an unsolicited positive review.
Especially from such a lovely person as that particular client, who's always been an absolute delight to work
Mm,
for, and who I know is someone with very high standards of customer service and always prides herself on looking after her clients.
mm. Well, I'm not surprised you got such a lovely review. I've known you for so long, and know the quality and the dedication of the work that you do. So, yes.
Well, that is very kind of you, Owen. And since we last spoke, anything happened with you in Leafield?
Oh, lots. I mean, last week was the first week of the new financial year, and it's a lot of uh, finishing off of requests for information for tax time, and lots of people wanting to get their depreciation reports done for tax time. So helping with that. But we're also in a bit of a growth phase as well come 1st of July. So we've got a new staff member starting this week. So we were getting that organised, and we might have a new region to operate, not a new state, but maybe a new region to open and that I'll be able to announce in the coming weeks. So working on that, and yes, exciting times. We've got a small rent roll, that we're in the process of acquiring, and that'll come on next week. So lots happening.
Well, considering how much work you've got to do, I think we should get straight on with the podcast.
Oh, okay. Yes, very true. All right. What's in the news this week, Nick?
Well, as always, we've got three stories to share. The first one, property owners enjoying long-term profits. CoreLogic's latest pain and gain report found that 94.3% of vendors who sold their home in the March quarter were able to sell it for more than their initial purchase price. This was the highest rate of profit-making sales since 2010. Vendors who sold their home in the March quarter had owned their property for a median of 8.8 years. And during those 8.8 years, Australia's median property price increased 58.2%, which tells you why most people made a profit. Owen, what does that data tell you about the nature of property ownership?
Well, yes, the nature of property ownership is that over time, you values will increase, and it's about time in the market, but you can't always time the market correctly. So yes, a lot of property owners now have done well in the past 10 years or so. But in the previous 10 years, in Sydney at least, they would have struggled. So it's yes, over the long term, property does generally go up in price, but yes, you can't always time the market. So it's I would warn against anyone who thinks that just because it's done well in this last 8.8 years, as the article references, it doesn't mean it'll always do that.
That's why I like what you said earlier about time in the market rather than timing the market. Another thing that's interesting, when you look at the ABS data every 3 months on household wealth, it's clear that most of our wealth is tied up in property. We have more wealth in property than we do shares and superannuation. And so Owen, for most Australians, property ownership is the key to building long-term wealth. So I'm wondering, do you believe that federal and state governments have a responsibility to facilitate property ownership among Australians?
Um, I don't think they have a responsibility to facilitate property ownership. I believe that should be a a choice of the individual. In terms of helping people gain ownership of a house, is it a good thing for governments to help? Yes. So I'm being picky with the words, maybe. It shouldn't be the responsibility of government to interfere in anyone's lives, I don't think. So I guess that's why I'm picking on that word, but it's a good idea for any Australians to take advantage of any tax incentives or government handouts to help them get into ownership.
And going back to what you said a moment ago about how prices historically have increased over the long term, given that prices tend to rise over the long term, why do so many investors sell up after just a few years?
Well, and this is a good question. It's something I'm passionate about helping investors stay in a property, an investment property for a long time. The figures could be skewed a little bit because a lot of investors fall into property investment because they buy their home that they've been living in, and then they upgrade to a bigger home, and then they choose to keep their old home as an investment property. And the home you want to live in isn't necessarily the best investment property. So it's usually a negative experience for a lot of people who go down that track of keeping their old home as an investment property. And they don't get the right type of tenants. It's not a good performing property from a yield income point of view. Might be an older home, so there's not really much in terms of tax benefits. And because it's almost like they're keeping it because they want to keep the property that they have so many memories in, and it's not bought for pure investment purposes to be able to be a good investment, it generally doesn't become a good investment. So that's one reason. But another reason is, yes, people don't consider buying a good investment property from a cash flow point of view, and they find it difficult to keep a property when they start going through hard times, and they haven't considered all of the variables to be able to make sure that they can keep a property for the long term. And it's yeah, and sometimes people are buying a property for short-term capital gain, which can happen, and they might realize some of that, and by selling it short term. So it's not all negative reasons why it might be short term, but I'm guessing from what I just discussed, it can often be a bad experience that they've had as a result of poor decisions of buying that first home as an investment property, or turning their original home into an investment property when they upgrade.
I remember years ago when I read the classic book, Making Money Made Simple by Noel Whittaker, which is such a great book. He made the point that's always remained with me that he's a big fan of property investing, not necessarily because of the capital growth or the yield, but because it's a forced savings device. Every time you make a mortgage payment, you're forced to build equity. And so he makes the point that if you can just hold on to the property, you're forced to build all this wealth. And that's why, going back to the idea of people selling up early on, if they can just structure their affairs so that they're able to hold this property over the long term, even if it's not the world's greatest property, they're going to accumulate an enormous amount of equity just because of this forced savings device.
Yeah. And then capital growth is on top.
Mm. Well, let's move on to our second story, which is a nice segue. Government offers fresh housing assistance. Good news for first home buyers and single parents wanting to buy a property. The federal government has issued another 50,000 places in the Home Guarantee Scheme for the 2024-25 financial year. That includes 35,000 places for the first home guarantee, 10,000 places for the regional first home buyer guarantee, and 5,000 places for the family home guarantee. These schemes allow eligible buyers to purchase a property with as little as a 2% deposit without having to pay LMI. Owen, I'm very keen to get your thoughts on the home guarantee scheme. Do you think it's a helpful program, or does it just increase demand without fixing the supply side problem?
Yes, it is more on the latter of yes, it's just causing more demand, uh, rather than the blanket approach of many government schemes where it's just a grant to anyone that qualifies. This is at least a limited availability scheme, and is usually fully taken up, and there's people that miss out, and it's targeted as well for your regional and families. So it's and I believe there's a lot more of a rigorous qualification within the scheme as well. So it's yes, at this point in time when we don't have a demand issue, we have a supply issue. It does add to the demand, but it's at least better than the blanket approach of most government schemes to first home buyers, and it's enabling some people who, without any other assistance, wouldn't be able to get into a affordable house, get started. So it's one of the better of the government schemes.
What's interesting, as someone who's a long-time journalist and who's spent years writing about these schemes, I don't know how many articles I've written about this scheme coming and this scheme going and this scheme changing. Federal and state governments are constantly introducing new schemes and axing schemes and changing. Do you think governments are genuinely trying to solve the housing affordability problem with these schemes, Owen, or are they just political gimmicks?
Well, as you were talking about, the new scheme being announced every couple of months, it's that might be just to be able to get a new headline, and and they're just fiddling with it to try and get it done. But and of course it's people who can take advantage of it. It can be a good thing for them to get into the market, and so that's not a bad thing. And yes, it's good PR for the government to be able to get votes at the next election. But of course, they're always reinventing the wheel so that they can announce a new scheme to help first home buyers get into their property. But I think, as we've spoken about before, first home buyers are a very small amount of all of the purchases made in the property market. So it gets probably 10 times the amount of coverage in the news as a result of compared to the amount of purchases that are actually made. But it's a good news story.
Let's move on to our final story, which is yields low in Sydney, high in Darwin. The latest CoreLogic data for gross rental yields shows that the median investment property delivered a yield of 3.7% in June. That included yields of 4.4% in the combined regions and 3.5% in the combined capitals. Drilling down on the individual capital cities, yields were 6.5% in Darwin, 4.4% in Perth, 4.3% in Hobart, 3.9% in Canberra, 3.8% in Adelaide and Brisbane, 3.6% in Melbourne, 3.1% in Sydney. Owen, why are yields so high in Darwin, 6.5%?
Well, as far as I'm aware, Darwin has been lacking some capital growth for a while, and it's maybe there's a supply issue. It really hasn't come on our radar. So there's not a lot of investors that I know of. I'm not getting asked, when can you start up in Darwin, to be able to start looking after our clients from the likes of buyers agents and so on. So even though buyers agents would love the yields, there must be other factors that are are showing them that there's not the capital growth expected. That being said, though, usually once you start getting up to that, 5.5%, 6% plus in yields, that's when you need to start looking of, is this an opportunity? Because are we going to start expecting some capital growth? I remember in the 2000s, in the late 2000s in Sydney, we were starting to creep up to those 5.5% mark and 6% even. So in parts of Sydney, and because we'd had such a long period of next to no capital growth in Sydney. So it's and then of course we had the GFC, which just extended out that period even longer, and then the market just started to explode a few years later. So that's probably the basic explanation. There's Darwin historically doesn't have a short cycle of flat and growth periods. So it might be just a matter of wait and see when Darwin takes off again.
Now, speaking of Sydney, so we had Darwin at 6.5%. Sydney was at the other extreme, yield of 3.1%. Why a yield so low in Sydney?
Yes, well, to continue on with what I was just mentioning, in Sydney we've had two very large boom periods within a short period of time. So that's pushed the values a lot higher. And even though rents, because we always get told and we always hear in the news about rents being sky high in Sydney and they keep going up all the time, but they haven't kept up anywhere near to what the values have grown. So as a comparison, Sydney is very cheap to rent compared to the value of the property. So that's why there's probably more rent-festers in Sydney than anywhere else, because they can't afford to buy where they want to live, and it's just so cheap to rent in comparison to the trying to buy that property that they want to live in.
For people who are thinking about buying an investment property, whether you're a rent investor or a standard property investor, how much attention should investors pay to yields when they're researching where and what to buy?
Oh, it should be. There's three major things that an investor should look at when they're looking at buying, and yields is one of the top two. It's so when you're looking at yields, going back to our earlier story about why do investors the average what was it, the average ownership of an investment property is about 3 years, you said, and that is primarily because they work out that they can't afford to keep the property after a short period of time. So they might go into a property for emotional reasons. They might go into buying the property because they think it's going to go up in price by a lot and in value a lot, so that they can sell it for a huge capital gain. But along the way, they've realized there's all these costs involved with keeping an investment property. And they just assume that the rent is going to cover the costs, and they don't do that research up front. So let's take the emotion out of it. Yes, capital gain is one of the other two major factors that you want to look at for being able to build wealth through property investment. But you need to make sure you can hold on to it long enough to be able to realize some capital gain. And the only way to do that is to be able to have a decent yield. So yes, it's very important.
And you mentioned yield is one of the three big things investors should look at. What are the other two?
Yes, so the main other one is capital growth. looking at potential for capital growth, and the third one, and it should be always the third one is tax reasons.
Okay, well, I always love our chats, Owen. I find them very interesting, and I also learn from hearing about your decades of experience. Thank you so much for sharing that each week, and see you again next week.
No worries, Nick, and thank you for bringing the news so that we can have this discussion each week. And enjoy Darwin. It's with your t-shirt and shorts, first thing in the morning. It's just like, yeah, you're making us all sick. Yeah.
Well, I will be coming from Darwin again
With
next week.
jealousy, of course. Yeah. So, all right, we'll see you next week, Nick.